They told us it was just the beginning, that one small step would lead to many more. But after 1972, silence, no footprints, no flags, no astronauts. Why? In a time when we can send rovers to Mars, why haven't we returned to the moon? Is it cost, politics, or something much darker? What if the reason we never went back is because of what we found there? Chapter 1. The Last Footprints. His name was Eugene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17. As he climbed back into the lunar module, he left behind more than just boot prints. He left behind silence. It was December 14, 1972. The final human stepped off the surface of the moon. That was over 50 years ago. Since then, no human has returned. This might not sound strange at first, but think about it. A single moon mission costs about $25 billion in today's money. The Vietnam War was draining resources. Americans were asking, why spend money up there when we have problems down here? In the span of just 3 years, from 1969 to 1972, we landed 12 men on the moon. We built enormous rockets, guided them across 384,000 kilometers of space, landed them with precision, and brought them home safely. All of that. The Saturn V rocket meant for Apollo 20 ended up launching Skylab, the first US space station, but the rest, archived, forgotten, left to gather dust in warehouses. The astronauts were being trained, so what happened? But instead of using the moon as a base for future exploration like Mars or deep space, we turned our attention back to Earth orbit. The focus shifted to the Space Shuttle and Low Earth projects, almost like someone didn't want people to ask too many questions, with computers far weaker than a modern calculator. Plus, the political climate had changed. The moon race was over. The US had won. The need to prove ourselves was gone. And then ... it just stopped. It was the longest time humans ever spent on the moon, over 3 days. During that time, they traveled further than any previous crew, collected the most rock samples, and filmed hours of footage. You don't abandon the frontier, you build on it. You push further. That's human nature, especially when the technology and funding were already in place. But when you start connecting the dots, cancelled missions, repurposed equipment, missing data, you begin to see a different pattern. Major programs with billions in investment don't vanish without a trace. They evolve, they expand, unless something or someone decides otherwise. A pattern that suggests we may have found something or encountered something that made further visits risky or undesirable. He said, "We leave as we came, and, God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." Astronauts grew unusually quiet about certain aspects of their time on the moon. Some engineers claimed they were ordered to destroy or erase specific flight data. NASA had planned more missions: Apollo 18, 19, even 20. The infrastructure was ready. The rockets were under construction. But by early 1970, the mission was scrapped. So was Apollo 19, then 18. Each one erased from the flight plan, one after another. The official explanation is simple. Budget cuts, public interest was fading, political priorities shifted, and the price tag was too high. It's a reasonable answer, but not a complete one. Because here's the thing. After achieving one of the greatest milestones in human history, you don't just walk away. In fact, just a year before the final moon landing, NASA had announced Apollo 20 would explore the Copernicus crater area, thought to contain strange rock formations. Some of the hardware from those cancelled missions was quietly Even stranger, the decision to cancel the remaining Apollo missions wasn't sudden. It unfolded behind closed doors. Quiet memos, reassignments, minimal press coverage, and when you dig into the details, those questions only multiply. The Apollo program had momentum. 6 successful landings, public excitement, scientific discoveries. It's like reaching the summit of Mount Everest, planting your flag, then never climbing another mountain again. Now, some experts argue that the missions were never sustainable. The Saturn V was powerful, but not reusable. Each flight burned millions, but even that feels like a convenient excuse. Behind the scenes, there were whispers. Former contractors described sudden changes in mission goals. None of this proves anything sinister, but it hints at something bigger, something unexplained. Take, for example, the strange case of Apollo 17's extended lunar stay. But there are odd gaps in the mission logs. conversations cut short, camera angles that abruptly change, certain sections of audio that were mysteriously labeled lost. Again, this doesn't confirm a conspiracy, but it raises a question we'll keep returning to throughout this story. What were they really doing up there? NASA says it was all part of scientific research, and that may be true. Of course, these ideas are uncomfortable. It's much easier to believe that we stopped going simply because we got bored or broke, but history rarely works that way. And that's what makes the silence so haunting. The last words spoken on the moon by Eugene Cernan were hopeful, but decades passed, and no one returned. That's not just a pause, it's a mystery, one that has lingered for half a century, and one that deserves a closer look. More guarded, reports became drier, press briefings avoided certain topics. It's almost as if something about the moon had become off limits, because in the years that followed, a strange shift occurred. NASA's tone changed. The way the moon was discussed became more cautious. So let's be clear, this isn't about proving a conspiracy. It's about asking the questions no one else will. Questions like, because the truth about the moon may not lie on its surface. Why were the most advanced missions suddenly cancelled? What caused the last astronauts to speak in vague, poetic language instead of plain facts? And most of all, what did we find on the moon that we're still not talking about? As we move into the next chapter, we leave the launch pads and spacesuits behind Dan, dig into what was happening behind closed doors in Washington, Moscow, and Houston. It was about power. Whoever controlled the sky would control the future. That's why President Kennedy pushed so hard for a moon landing. It wasn't just for science. It was a show of strength. Politicians started asking different questions, not, how do we go farther, but what does it cost? The vision shrank. The goals changed. Exploration took a backseat to politics. It may lie in the politics that kept us from going back. Chapter 2. The political silence. Classified budgets for military space programs grew. Satellites, surveillance systems, and high-altitude craft became the new focus. Some of this was for defense. Some of it, we don't know. But if you listen closely not to the rockets, but to the records, you start to hear a different kind of noise. Not with astronauts, but with powerful telescopes and probes. Why? What were they looking for? No one ever gave a straight answer. Two global superpowers suddenly lost interest in the most important goal in human history, and both decided without public debate not to go back. Intelligence agencies operated in layers of deception. Entire missions were launched and buried without a single headline, and space was no exception. But behind that simple story was a much more complex and unsettling truth. And when questions about the moon came up, officials gave polite but rehearsed replies. After Apollo, there was a long pause in manned lunar ambitions. But then in the 2000s, countries like China, India, and even private companies started aiming for the moon again. NASA, too, announced the Artemis program, a plan to return humans to the moon. When they receive heavily censored pages or are told the files no longer exist. Sometimes the reason given is national security. But what kind of national security risk comes from a 50-year-old moon mission? The USSR had the technology to reach the moon. Their N-1 rocket program was a direct competitor to Apollo, but after several failures, it was quietly abandoned. No press conferences, no public closure, just an empty launch pad and a pile of classified files. Political noise, the kind that doesn't come from space, but from the rooms where decisions are made. Others believe they were warned off either by the Americans or by something else. In several interviews over the years, he's hinted at things that were never part of the official narrative, but others believe he was referring to more than just geology. At one point, he mentioned seeing a light following the Apollo 11 craft. NASA later explained it as debris boot. The way Aldrin talks about it still raises eyebrows. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, America won that round of the space race. The flag was planted. The world watched in awe. But after that, the urgency vanished. It is almost like the mission had been more about beating the Soviets than building a future in space. After Apollo 17, the moon went quiet. No more landings, no more missions, just static. When NASA ended the Apollo program, the message was clear. Funding was gone, the public was uninterested, and the space race was over. Let's go back to the 1960s. The United States was locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Space wasn't just about exploration, and it worked. That shift matters. Because once the moon was no longer a battlefield for superpowers, the appetite for space travel dried up. But here's where it gets strange. Even as public moon missions ended, government spending on space didn't stop. It just moved into the shadows. Documents declassified decades later revealed that both the US and the Soviet Union were quietly observing the moon long after Apollo. Meanwhile, NASA grew more careful in its language. Mission reports became vague. Interviews with astronauts were tightly managed. Take Buzz Aldrin, for example. Or consider the famous quote from Neil Armstrong during his post-mission speech. He said, "We have only scratched the surface." Manny brushed it off as poetic. And then there's the silence from the Soviet side. Some say the Soviets found something that changed their mind. Of course, these are theories, but the patterns are real. Let's not forget, during the Cold War, secrecy was standard. In fact, many Apollo-related documents remain redacted to this day, unless the risk wasn't from Earth. Here's another oddity. And suddenly, the language changed again. NASA officials began talking about sustainable lunar presence, gateway stations, and unexplored regions. But whenever someone asked, why are we really going back? The answers remained vague. But there's something else in the air, a sense that the moon has unfinished business, that there's more there than we were told. Yes, science is a reason. So is international cooperation. But in private, they suggest that certain discoveries, geological anomalies, strange readings, unexplained signets, caused serious concern during Apollo. Enough concern to trigger a political shutdown, and satellites in every orbit. We still know shockingly little about the moon. We still rely on decades-old data. And the agencies that promise to take us back have moved slowly, cautiously, as if they're not just preparing for a mission, but preparing for something unexpected. The rockets, the modules, the gear. Because some say the reason we never went back is simple. We couldn't. Some former insiders have hinted at this. Engineers, contractors, even a few astronauts. Most won't speak on record. A quiet agreement. A decision to pause human exploration until we understood more, until it was safer. If true, that would explain the silence. Not just from NASA, but from every major government involved in lunar observation. How could a 1960s achievement be something we can't repeat? But it's something NASA officials have said more than once. In interviews, some engineers explain that the hardware from the Apollo era was destroyed or dismantled, and rebuilding it would take too much time and money. And that brings us to a strange irony. In our most transparent age, with cameras on every phone, it was used for every moon landing mission. Not one of them failed. Yet today, over 50 years later, no rocket of that scale has made it back to the moon. What would make the world's most powerful nations turn away from the moon? What kind of discovery could cause such a retreat? That NASA wasn't given enough funding to keep Saturn V production alive. But there's another problem. According to former NASA workers, the blueprints, production techniques, and engineering know-how for the Saturn V weren't just lost, they were erased. Many of the original documents were thrown away or taped over. Key engineers retired or passed on. Some of the technology was never fully documented in the first place. Between Earth and the moon lies the Van Allen radiation belt's a zone of intense charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. But many scientists have questioned how safe that really was. Some argue the radiation levels were underestimated. Others wonder if the Apollo astronauts were more heavily shielded than we've been told. To reach the moon, astronauts have to pass through them. That dust, by the way, is no ordinary dirt. It's razor sharp, electrostatically charged, and gets into everything. Apollo astronauts reported it sticking to their suits, clogging joints, and even irritating their lungs. We don't have the full answer, but we do have a trail. It runs through dusty archives, missing tapes, quiet interviews, and budget lines buried under defense jargon. Equipment has to survive, both freezing cold and intense heat. Spacesuits must be flexible, airtight, and durable. Lunar landers need to operate on uneven terrain with no margin for error. Why not just create something better? Modern materials, modern code, modern guidance systems. Shouldn't it be easier now? And modern rockets like the Space Launch System are only now later beginning to approach the capabilities we once had. In the next chapter, we'll follow that trail into the technical side of things. Others say, we could, we just didn't want to. Chapter 3. Technical myths and real risks. One of the most common explanations for why we never returned to the moon is this: we lost the technology. At first, That sounds impossible. We're living in an era of smartphones, reusable rockets, and AI. But that answer raises more questions than it solves. Let's break it down. Back in the 1960s, NASA built the Saturn V rocket towering machine that remains the most powerful launch vehicle ever flown. That doesn't mean we haven't tried. The space shuttle was impressive in its own way, but it never left low Earth orbit. So what happened? Some say it's simply about cost. In other words, we had a machine that could take us to the moon and then we forgot how to build it. Still, let's say we wanted to go back today. Here's where things get complicated. There are real risks involved in lunar travel. Risks we often ignore. One of the biggest is radiation. NASA says the Apollo missions moved through these belts quickly to limit exposure. Then there's the lunar environment itself. No atmosphere, no magnetic field, just a vacuum and a lot of dust. Modern engineers still haven't solved that problem, and that's just one. Temperature swings on the moon are extreme, hundreds of degrees between night and day. And remember, every kilogram of gear costs fuel. Every system adds complexity. Every launch is a high-stakes event. During Apollo, NASA managed to thread the needle. They accepted the risks and pulled off the impossible. But since then, the space industry has become more cautious, more regulated, The idea of sending humans to the moon with 21st century safety standards suddenly becomes a logistical nightmare. So maybe we didn't stop because we couldn't go. Maybe we stopped because we couldn't go safely. Because if the technical challenges were truly that great, how did we manage it 6 times in the late 60s and early 70s? Never again. Indeed, there are gaps in the video and audio archives, missing tapes, scrubbed transmissions. NASA has acknowledged that many of the original broadcast tapes, including the highest quality versions of the Apollo 11 landing, were accidentally erased or reused. That still doesn't explain everything though. That's where alternative theories start to form. And if that's true, then maybe something happened during those later missions, something dangerous, unexpected, or even terrifying. Some suggest that the Apollo missions were far more experimental than we realized, that NASA took massive risks, perhaps even pushing the limits of what was possible. Others believe the missions were edited before release, that certain parts of the footage were altered or hidden. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we understand. Rarely do they get into specifics about what they saw, how it felt, or what they might have noticed that wasn't in the script. It's not evidence of anything, but it adds to the overall sense that there's more to the story. That fact alone continues to fuel doubt. Not just dust and rock, but anomalies, lights, sounds, and claims that don't fit into the clean, scientific version of the story. Even the astronauts' own words sometimes add fuel to the fire. In interviews, they often describe their experiences in vague or poetic terms. But even with all this tech, we still haven't sent people. It's as if we're testing the waters, cautiously checking to see if the moon has changed or if something's waiting. Then there's the question of automation. All reasonable explanations for why we never returned to the moon. But there's another side to this story, one that's harder to prove but even harder to ignore. But after their missions, some of them gave interviews or made comments that felt off. It's a cryptic sentence. Some say it was just poetic. Others think it was a hint. NASA later said it was just a piece of the rocket, but Aldrin seemed unsure. In later interviews, he avoided going into detail. NASA says it's due to technical issues, but conspiracy theorists believe something else was being covered up. Vague statements, strange pauses, and sometimes a quiet suggestion that there was more to the mission than rocks and samples. According to these stories, they had spotted something on the rim of a nearby crater, something they weren't expecting. Structures, lights, objects. It sounds like science fiction, but this claim has circulated for decades. In recent years, we've sent many unmanned missions to the moon. China has landed rovers. NASA has crash-tested probes. And maybe that's what this all leads to. Uncertainty. In Apollo videos, there are moments when strange lights appear in the sky. Flashes, movements, unexplained reflections. NASA usually attributes them to lens flares or sunlight bouncing off equipment. That's probably true in many cases, but not always. Yes, the moon is just a rock in space, but it's also unfamiliar territory, harsh, unpredictable, mysterious. So when people ask, why haven't we gone back? Maybe the real answer is this: because going back means facing the unknown, and we don't like unknown. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what some people believe we found on the moon. Some of it is speculation. Some of it is recorded, but all of it leads to the same question. What did we see on the moon that made us turn away? Chapter 4. What we might have found. Until now, we've talked about politics, priorities, and technology, because for years, people have claimed that what we found on the moon was far more unusual than what NASA ever admitted. Let's start with the astronauts themselves. Most of them were trained military pilots, disciplined, precise, not the type to exaggerate. Buzz Aldrin, for example, once mentioned seeing a light following Apollo 11 on the way to the moon. Neil Armstrong, during a speech years after the mission, said, "There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." And then there are the gaps in the recordings. Several Apollo missions have segments of missing audio. Parts of the communication between Houston and the astronauts are cut, distorted, or simply marked as lost. Some even claim that during Apollo 11, Armstrong and Aldrin switched to a private radio channel after landing. Again, there's no solid proof, but the persistence of these stories is unusual. Let's look at some of the footage. In some frames, shadows fall in strange directions, leading some to suggest artificial lighting. Others point to the famous photo of the lunar lander and question why its legs didn't leave deeper marks in the dust. Either way, it adds to the sense that something isn't right, even though astronauts' footprints are visible all around. Patterns that look like walls, towers, or domes. These images are grainy and open to interpretation. NASA has never confirmed anything unusual, but that hasn't stopped the speculation. Skeptics say it's over. Believers say it's evidence. Most mainstream scientists dismiss them as pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, like seeing shapes in clouds, especially as we begin preparing for a return to the moon through the Artemis program. Then there are the claims about ancient structures, signals beamed from hidden equipment. Others say it wasn't ancient but active, that we encountered something intelligent, watching, waiting, something we weren't ready for. Still, the pattern remains. Strange reports, followed by silence. It did exactly that, thousands of them. But interestingly, some areas seem to have fewer images than others. Some files are still not publicly available, and when asked why, NASA usually gives the same answer. Nothing to see there. They talk about hidden footage, off-the-record briefings, and tasks they didn't fully understand at the time. One technician claimed he saw live feeds from Apollo that were never broadcast. Another said he was ordered to erase tapes without asking questions. Some researchers believe satellite photos of the moon show formations that appear to geometric to be natural. There's even a name for this theory: lunar anomalies. Entire books have been written about them, websites filled with zoomed-in images and detailed arguments, but others aren't so quick to look away. The idea is that a discovery like ancient technology or evidence of life would change everything. The world might not be ready. In 2009, NASA launched a lunar reconnaissance orbiter. Its job was to take high-resolution photos of the moon's surface. Exploration often uncovers things we didn't expect, sometimes wonderful, sometimes dangerous, and sometimes it changes us in ways we can't undo. That's probably true, but the timing is curious, which brings us to a deeper question. If we did find something on the moon, because the story isn't over, Artemis is coming. Private companies are entering the race, but as we prepare to return to the moon, we have to ask. But even in government documents, you find hints. Declassified files from the Cold War show that both the US and the USSR were monitoring the moon for unexpected activity. Some reports mention transient lunar phenomena, brief flashes of light, moving shadows, unexplained energy readings, all with better answers. This time, the goal is a permanent presence. Bases, rovers, science stations, even preparation for future missions to Mars. What could it be? But when you look closer, you realize that Artemis isn't just a continuation. Some say it was ancient, left behind by an unknown civilization. Structures buried under lunar dust. These claims are fringe, of course. NASA admits these events have been recorded, but they say they're natural, caused by moonquakes or solar activity. Even more curious are the whistleblowers. Over the years, a few former employees and contractors have come forward, some anonymous, others public. Can we verify these claims? Not easily. But when different people tell similar stories over decades, it's worth paying attention. So why would NASA or any space agency hide something like this? The answers vary. Some say fear, others say control, or maybe the agencies themselves weren't ready. Maybe they didn't fully understand what they found, and maybe that's why we stopped going. Not because we had nothing left to learn, but because we learned too much, too fast, and the only safe choice was to walk away. It's a chilling thought, but one that echoes through history. So the next time you look at the moon, calm, silent, unchanging, remember this. For thousands of years, we looked up and dreamed about going there. We finally made it, and then we never returned. That silence isn't just scientific, it's emotional, it's personal. It feels like a door that was opened then quickly closed. In the next chapter, we'll look at what's happening now. Are we going back with better tools? Chapter 5, Artemis, and the unfinished story. The last human stepped off the moon in 1972. For over half a century, the silence remained. But now, something has changed. NASA is going back. The Artemis program is the agency's bold plan to return humans to the lunar surface. Not just for short visits, but to stay. It sounds exciting, inspiring, like a long-awaited sequel to Apollo. And maybe a quiet attempt to finish something that was left undone. Artemis is named after the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology. A fitting title, but also a clue. This isn't just about exploration, it's about revisiting something we once turned away from. After that, a landing, a base near the moon's south pole, a gateway station that will orbit the moon like a miniature space station. NASA says the first crewed Artemis mission will send astronauts into lunar orbit. But here's what's strange. The south pole of the moon is one of the least explored regions. That's fair. But the language they use is cautious, vague, technical, but non. And when asked directly about risks or anomalies, the answers are often rehearsed. Its terrain is rugged, covered in deep, dark craters. Some parts never see sunlight, others hold frozen water. But it is also the same area where reports of transient lunar phenomena have been most common. NASA doesn't mention that. Instead, they talk about science, sustainability, and long-term goals. Even stranger is the way Artemis is being built, without much press, without many updates. And when they do release footage, it's heavily edited, clean, sanitized, almost too perfect. Unlike Apollo, which was fully under NASA's control, Artemis is a patchwork of government agencies, defense contractors, and private companies. SpaceX is developing the lander. Boeing is building parts of the rocket. Prepared for something we didn't fully understand the first time. Lockheed Martin, Blue Origin, Northrop Grumman, everyone's involved. Missions rescheduled without clear explanations. And a growing list of tasks labeled classified. A chance to rewrite a great chapter in human history. It feels more like a military operation than a scientific mission. Public-private partnerships, faster development, streamlined budgets, but others aren't so sure. And sometimes, going back is the only way to face what we left behind. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does raise the question, why so much secrecy? Some insiders say it's just a new way of doing things. Others think it will confirm that the moon is just rock and dust, and that all the mystery was in our heads. Because while NASA has been talking publicly about Artemis since 2017, much of the actual progress has happened quietly. Behind the scenes, there are rumors, engineers working under strict test flights with unexplained delays, but the intention is clear. We are going back. Of course, this could all be standard bureaucracy. Big missions always move slowly. It's part of our story, and that story is unfinished. But when you remember the history, the sudden end of Apollo, the missing data, the strange interviews, it feels like more than just red tape. It feels like caution, as if we're going back, but carefully, quietly. And that brings us to the deeper question. What is Artemis really about? NASA says it's about science, exploration, and inspiration. And maybe it is. Maybe Artemis is just a long overdue return, or finally finish the first. And if you want to keep searching with us, share your theory in the comments, and let's dig deeper together. But maybe it's also something else, a response to what we found or didn't find on the moon the first time, or to confront something old. Remember, exploration isn't just about moving forward, it's about understanding where we've been. Some people believe Artemis will reveal new discoveries, strange structures, signals, or even contact. But either way, the return is happening. And this time, we're bringing better cameras, stronger transmitters, more eyes, more questions, and maybe fewer secrets. So where does that leave us? For now, we're still waiting, Artemis hasn't landed yet. The pieces are still being built. The rockets still need testing. The schedules keep shifting. Not because it's easy, not because it's cheap, but because we have to. Something about the moon keeps pulling us in, not just as scientists or engineers, but as a species. Maybe we were never meant to stay away forever. Maybe the silence was only temporary. But before we land again, before the next boots hit the dust, we should ask, are we returning to explore, or to explain, to build something new, to write the next chapter? Because in the end, the moon hasn't changed. It's still there, still watching, still waiting. The only question is, what are we truly going back to find? If this left you with more questions than answers, you're not alone. There's more out there than we're allowed to know. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the next chapter.